This is not a victory speech. This is the sound of a crisis getting bigger while Washington pretends it is already over. Because if this war was won in the first hour, then why are oil markets shaking? Why are strategic reserves being discussed like emergency lifeboats? Why is the Strait of Hormuz turning from a shipping lane into a pressure point for the entire world economy? What we're watching right now is not just another exchange of missiles in the Middle East. It is the collision between political messaging and battlefield reality. One side is declaring success. The other side is still escalating, still imposing costs, and still proving that this conflict can spread far beyond Iran, Israel, or the Persian Gulf. And that is the real danger here. Because once a war starts driving energy prices, global trade, and regional military calculations at the same time, it stops being a headline and starts becoming a strategic earthquake. Here is what appears to have happened. While the White House was projecting confidence and talking as if the operation had already been decided, the battlefield was sending a very different message. According to the discussion in the transcript, the conflict did not stabilize after the opening phase. It widened. Oil prices surged back toward the $100 mark. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was described as severely disrupted, and reports in that discussion claimed that Iranian action had expanded from missile retaliation into direct pressure on maritime traffic and energy flows. In other words, this was no longer just a military exchange. It was becoming an economic confrontation with global consequences. The key players are now clear. On one side, you have the United States and Israel trying to project control, deterrence, and momentum. On the other side, you have Iran, which is being framed not as a collapsing state, but as an actor still capable of striking back, absorbing punishment, and escalating in ways that hit the global system where it hurts most. Around them sits the larger region, Gulf states hosting US. Assets, energy markets, watching every headline, and international powers quietly calculating what happens if this drags on. And that is why this story matters. Because the immediate stakes are not just who hit whom or who can claim a symbolic victory on television. The real stakes are credibility, escalation, and control. If Washington says the war was effectively won early, but Iran is still imposing costs, then the central question becomes impossible to ignore. Was the opening narrative wrong, or has the situation already slipped beyond the plan? And if Hormuz remains the pressure point, then every extra day of disruption raises the price not just of oil, but of miscalculation itself. That brings us to the deeper layer of this crisis. None of this came out of nowhere, and once you look at the background, the present escalation starts to look less like chaos and more like the result of failures that were building for years. This crisis did not begin with one speech, one strike, or one tanker. It sits on top of a much older structure of pressure that has been building for years. The first layer is energy. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another narrow waterway on the map. In 2024 and early 2025, roughly 20 million barrels per day moved through it, accounting for about 1/5 of global oil and petroleum consumption and more than 1/4 of total seaborne oil trade. Around 1/5 of global LNG trade also moved through that same corridor. And even the backup options are limited. The IEA says only Saudi Arabia and the UAE have operational crude pipelines that can bypass Hormuz, with perhaps 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of spare capacity. That means the world was already structurally vulnerable long before this latest escalation began. The second layer is strategic memory. Since the killing of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, the confrontation between Washington and Tehran never truly reset. It merely changed form. At the same time, Iran kept investing in missiles, drones, and the wider network often described as the axis of resistance, anchored through the IRGC and linked to actors in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and beyond. That matters because it means any war with Iran was never likely to remain neatly confined to Iran alone. The region had already become a web of overlapping fronts, where pressure on one node could trigger reactions elsewhere. The third layer is political overconfidence. The 2020 Abraham Accords were meant to symbolize a more stable regional order centered on normalization and deterrence. But that vision was always fragile because it rested on the assumption that the deeper conflict structure of the region could be managed without being resolved. By 2025, even supporters of regional integration were warning that Israeli moves on annexation and wider regional escalation could severely undermine that framework. So when the current war intensified, it did not hit a calm region. It hit a region already carrying unresolved fractures beneath the surface. And then there is the fourth layer, great power alignment. Iran is not an isolated actor in the way many Western narratives often imply. Russia and Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership in January 2025, later ratified in both countries, while China remained the dominant buyer of Iranian oil, taking more than 80% of Iran's shipped crude in 2025, according to Kepler data cited by Reuters. That does not mean Moscow or Beijing are eager for open war. It means Tehran enters this crisis with more political depth, more economic breathing room, and more external relevance than a simplistic collapse scenario would suggest. So the real background to this story is not chaos. It is accumulated tension, an energy choke point the world cannot easily replace, a regional network built for indirect escalation, a diplomatic order weaker than it looked, and a balance of power no longer as one-sided as Washington likes to present. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. If this crisis is rooted in structural weakness rather than a temporary flare-up, then what exactly is each side now trying to achieve and at what cost? And this is where the story becomes much more serious than a simple question of who struck first or who issued the most confident statement. The first reality is that this conflict is no longer being judged by battlefield rhetoric. It is being judged by cost imposition. If one side says victory has already been achieved, but oil is still above $100, shipping insurers are still rattled, and commercial traffic through Hormuz remains under threat, then the claim of control starts to break down under its own weight. Reuters reported on March 13 that Brent had climbed back above $100, with Goldman citing damage to Middle East energy infrastructure and disruptions in Hormuz, while the U.S. Energy Information Administration warned that the strait was effectively closed to most shipping traffic because the threat of attack and loss of insurance drove tankers away. That means three things immediately. First, military messaging is no longer enough to stabilize markets. Second, economic pressure is now part of the battlefield itself. Third, every extra day of disruption damages not only the targeted enemy, but the credibility of the side claiming to be in charge. That is why the transcript's central contradiction matters so much. The more loudly victory is declared, the more dangerous the visible escalation becomes. The second reality is that Iran's leverage does not depend on conquering anything. It depends on making the global system feel vulnerable. The Strait of Hormuz carries nearly 20% of global oil supply and more than 20% of global LNG trade, and even the available bypass routes through Saudi and Emirati pipelines can only offset part of that exposure. Reuters reported that at least 16 civilian ships had already been attacked in the Gulf, while the EIA noted that the world was exposed to this choke point long before the present war. This is the strategic logic. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional sense to change the structure of the crisis. It only needs to create a sustained risk premium large enough to hurt every government that depends on stable energy flows. The consequences are enormous. 1. Inflation pressure spreads from fuel into transport, manufacturing, and food chains. 2. Allied governments begin making decisions based on economic pain, not alliance discipline. 3. Even countries outside the war are forced into emergency energy management. That is why this is not just a regional military confrontation. It is a battle over whether a middle power under attack can weaponize interdependence against stronger opponents. And right now, at least partially, it has shown that it can. The third reality is that America's military options become uglier the moment the war shifts from strikes to access. It is one thing to hit targets. It is another thing entirely to guarantee safe commercial transit through one of the most dangerous maritime choke points on Earth, while missiles, drones, mines, and proxy attacks remain in play. Reuters reported on March 12 that U.S. ship escorts through Hormuz would begin only when it was militarily feasible, and only after air superiority had been achieved and Iran's missile capability significantly degraded. That is not the language of immediate control. That is the language of conditional access. In the transcript, even discussion of a possible operation to seize parts of Iran's coastline is framed as a sign of how narrow and risky the menu has become, and the consequences of that are brutal. First, if escorts cannot begin quickly, the market reads delay as weakness. Second, if escorts do begin under fire, the mission itself becomes an escalation ladder. Third, if policymakers start entertaining ground solutions to reopen a waterway, then the war has already moved far beyond the original public promise of a limited operation. This is why the logistics question matters so much. Not because logistics are glamorous, but because logistics are where strategic fantasies usually go to die. The fourth reality is that time may not be working the way Washington wants it to work. Western political systems often assume that pressure accumulates mostly on the sanctioned, bombed, or isolated side. But here, time is generating pressure in multiple directions at once. Reuters reported that Iran-backed Shiite allies have stepped up strikes despite recent setbacks, including Hezbollah's heaviest rocket barrage of the conflict and escalating militia attacks in Iraq. Another Reuters report on March 13 said an Iran-backed Iraqi group claimed responsibility for downing a U.S. refueling aircraft in western Iraq, underscoring how quickly secondary fronts can threaten U.S. operations. This matters because it changes the geometry of the war. One front becomes several. One deterrence problem becomes a network problem. One military campaign becomes a test of whether the United States and Israel can absorb repeated pressure across different theaters while still protecting energy routes, bases, cities, and political credibility. The consequences are clear. First, every active proxy or aligned militia stretches air defense and intelligence resources thinner. Second, every new front complicates alliance management because regional partners start calculating survival rather than loyalty. Third, every day of unresolved fighting strengthens the perception that Iran's strategy was built for endurance, while its opponents were built for shock. And if that perception hardens, it becomes a strategic asset in its own right. And the fifth reality may be the most dangerous of all. This war is already reshaping the wider balance of power, even before it ends. Russia has publicly called for the war to stop, but at the same time, Moscow and Tehran are bound by a 2-0-year strategic pact approved in 2025, and Reuters has reported that Rosatom is still committed to major nuclear projects inside Iran despite the war. China, meanwhile, is not a spectator to energy shocks in the Gulf. Reuters reported that Beijing refused Sinopec's request to tap commercial reserves while also moving to preserve domestic fuel security as Middle East supplies came under strain. In other words, this is no longer a closed contest between Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran. It is now feeding into how Moscow, Beijing, energy markets, and the non-Western world interpret American power. The consequences here are even larger. 1. If the war drags on, Russia benefits from higher energy prices and from Western distraction. 2. China becomes even more focused on supply security and strategic insulation from U.S.-dominated choke points. 3. Every sign that the United States can strike hard but not stabilize outcomes pushes the world further toward a fragmented order where coercion is easier than control. And once that shift starts, it is very hard to reverse. Which brings us to the next and most dangerous layer of all, the point where this crisis stops being about a difficult war and starts becoming a historic turning point that may no longer be containable on its original terms. And this is the point where the crisis stops looking like a violent episode and starts looking like a structural break. Because a war becomes truly dangerous when it no longer depends on a single battlefield to keep escalating. That threshold now appears to have been crossed. By March 13, Brent had moved back above $100, commercial traffic through Hormuz remained heavily disrupted, and Reuters reported that at least 16 civilian ships had already been attacked in the Gulf. At the same time, U.S. Officials were still saying naval escorts would begin only when it became militarily feasible, after air superiority and major missile suppression had been achieved. That means the strategic center of gravity has shifted. The issue is no longer simply whether Iran can absorb strikes. The issue is whether the United States and its partners can restore normality fast enough to prove that escalation has limits. And right now, that proof is missing. That is why this moment is bigger than a single exchange of force. As long as Hormuz remains even partially paralyzed, the war is no longer contained inside the military domain. It is now writing itself into tanker routes, insurance decisions, fuel costs, industrial planning, and national security calculations far beyond the Gulf. Reuters reported that China had already refused Sinopec's request to tap part of the National Commercial Reserve, a sign that Beijing was treating the disruption as a live strategic problem rather than a passing headline. In other words, the conflict has reached the point where outside powers are not just watching it, they are beginning to reposition around it. And once that happens, wars become harder to reverse because every actor starts adapting to the possibility that instability may last. But the most dangerous escalation may not be the one visible in oil prices, it may be the one visible in time. Because every extra day that shipping remains threatened, every extra day that escorts are delayed, and every extra day that proxy or
America's
aligned
military
forces
options
keep pressure on the region
shifting from
sends the
strikes to
same
access.
message. This
US
is
ship
not
asks
a
and proxy
short,
delays define
clean
the new
demonstration of power.
A tense naval
It is a
scene
contest
unfolds.
over endurance, access, and political credibility. Once a stronger coalition discovers that it can strike but cannot quickly stabilize, the entire psychology of the war changes. Allies become nervous. Adversaries become bolder. Neutral states become hedgers, markets stop believing assurances, and domestic pressure inside the intervening powers starts to rise faster than policymakers expected. That is when escalation becomes self-feeding. Not because one side wants total war in a theatrical sense, but because too many actors now have incentives to keep testing the edges of what the other side can really control. And this is the darkest implication of all. Once a regional war begins to expose the gap between destructive power and stabilizing power, it stops being just a war in the Middle East. It becomes a referendum on the durability of the wider order behind it. If Washington cannot reopen the artery, if markets keep pricing in fear, if rivals keep adjusting to American difficulty rather than American dominance, then this conflict may be remembered not simply for what it destroyed, but for what it revealed. Not that the region is unstable. The region has long been unstable. What it may reveal is something much larger, that the system built to contain this kind of crisis no longer works the way its architects assumed. And once the world starts to believe that, the damage is no longer temporary. It becomes historical. So here is the real meaning of this story. This is not just a war report. It is a warning about the difference between striking power and controlling consequences. As of March 13, oil had climbed back above $100, commercial traffic through Hormuz remained heavily disrupted, and even Washington's own public language made clear that U.S. naval escorts would begin only when conditions became militarily feasible, after air superiority and major missile suppression. That is not what strategic closure looks like. That is what an unfinished crisis looks like. And that is why the most important question is no longer whether the opening blows were powerful. They clearly were. The real question is whether those blows produced control or whether they triggered a larger chain reaction that now has its own momentum. Because once a conflict starts driving oil prices, freezing shipping decisions, forcing emergency calculations in Beijing, and making every Gulf state think about vulnerability instead of confidence, the war has already escaped the neat boundaries politicians prefer to describe on television. China's refusal to tap major reserves for Sinopec and the broader scramble around Middle East supply security show that this crisis is being processed not as a local flare-up, but as a system-level shock. That is the deeper strategic lesson. Iran does not need to look stronger in every conventional category to change the meaning of the war. It only needs to prove that punishment is possible, persistence is possible, and disruption is possible. If it can do that, then every declaration of easy victory starts to sound less like confidence and more like insulation from reality. And once that happens, the battlefield stops being only physical. It becomes political. It becomes economic. It becomes psychological. Markets start asking one question, allies start asking another, adversaries start asking a third, and all of them are more dangerous than the press conference narrative. What makes this even more serious is that the wider world is already repositioning around it. Russia is publicly calling for an end to the war while maintaining its strategic alignment with Tehran, and China is clearly treating energy security as a live problem, not an abstract one. That means the conflict is no longer being measured only in sorties, strikes, or intercepted missiles. It is being measured in whether American power still looks like the power to shape outcomes or merely the power to open crises that become harder to contain. That distinction is everything. Because in a fragmented world, the side that can destroy is not automatically the side that can stabilize. And that is where the final warning comes in. If this war continues to widen the gap between what leaders say and what the system is actually experiencing, then the long-term damage may go far beyond Iran, Israel, or the Gulf. It will hit the credibility of deterrence itself. It will push rivals to believe that endurance can beat shock. It will teach middle powers that global choke points are leverage. And it will leave allies wondering whether American intervention still reduces danger or whether it sometimes multiplies it. That is why this moment matters. Not because it is loud, not because it is dramatic, but because it may be one of those rare moments when a regional war exposes a global truth. Power is no longer judged only by the ability to hit. It is judged by the ability to hit, absorb, stabilize, and still remain in control when the whole structure starts shaking.